The scent of lavender and eucalyptus clung to her skin like a second self, a fragrant shroud she could never quite wash away. Ilara Vance, at 23, moved with a practiced grace that belied the exhaustion etched deep into the fine lines around her eyes. Her hands, her most valuable assets, needed the tense muscles of a faceless client, her touch intuitive, firm, and profoundly soothing. She was a healer of aches she could not see, an architect of temporary peace for bodies burdened by wealth and power. Yet within her own body a quiet, hollow ache resided, a constant low hum of a life unlived, of choices never offered. She was a ghost in the opulent corridors of the five-star hotel spa, her presence defined only by the relief she provided, her own spirit as knotted and weary as the backs she tended to. If you want to know how these healing hands become entangled in a dangerous bargain, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Her world was a study in jarring contrasts, a daily pilgrimage between two universes that should never touch. The spa was a sanctuary of hushed tones, trickling water features, and air thick with expensive oils. Its gilded silence was a world away from the third-floor walk-up she called home. The journey back was a descent, from polished marble floors to cracked linoleum, from the scent of prosperity to the lingering smell of boiled cabbage, and damp in the narrow stairwell. Her apartment was small, cramped, and filled with the ghosts of unpaid bills that papered the small kitchen table. The city lights, glittering like a field of fallen stars from her smudged window, felt like a cruel taunt, a vibrant, sprawling party to which she would never be invited. The heart of her confinement, the epicenter of her sacrifice, was her mother's sick room. The space was meticulously clean, but smelled of antiseptic and the slow, sweet decay of illness. A rented medical bed dominated the room, and within it her mother was a fragile sketch of the woman she once was. A debilitating disease had stolen her mobility, her voice, and her future, leaving Ilara as her sole guardian and provider. The mountain of debt grew with every prescription filled, every doctor's visit, every new piece of equipment required to keep a fragile life from extinguishing. Ilara moved about the room with a quiet efficiency, changing linens, administering medication, her love a heavy, suffocating blanket of duty she wrapped around herself each and every day. She had become a phantom in her own existence, her identity subsumed by her roles: daughter, caregiver, earner. Her shyness was not a personality trait, but a shield, forged in the fires of responsibility that had consumed her youth. She learned to make herself small, to not have needs, to not take up space. At work, she observed the hotel's elite clientele from behind a veil of professional deference. She saw their casual power, their effortless confidence, their lives filled with travel and leisure, and felt not envy, but a profound and alienating disconnect. They were a different species, and she was merely part of the scenery, a silent functionary whose inner life was as invisible to them as the plumbing that ran through the walls. Her virginity was the quietest, most unexamined corner of this unlived life. It wasn't a conscious choice, a moral stance, or a product of trauma, but simply a consequence of a heart on lockdown. There had been no space for the tender, awkward explorations of youth. No late-night calls, no first dates, no room for the vulnerability that love required. Her body was a vessel for work and worry, and her heart, too guarded and too exhausted, had never learned the language of desire. It was a secret she kept, not out of shame, but because it was a symbol of her arrested development. A pristine, untouched room in a house that was otherwise crumbling under the weight of an unbearable burden. There were moments when the carefully constructed dam of her composure would threaten to break. It happened in the quiet moments between clients, hiding in the staff locker room, when she'd pull a crumpled past-due notice from her worn purse. Her hands, so steady when working on others, would tremble as she read the stark, red letters, or sometimes she would catch her reflection in the polished surface of an elevator door, a pale, serious young woman with old eyes, and a wave of vertigo would wash over her, a sudden, terrifying awareness of the years slipping by, of her own youth being poured out like a libation at the altar of her mother's illness, leaving her empty. This was the life Ilara Vance inhabited, a cycle of repetitive, draining motions that began before sunrise and ended long after midnight. Her dreams, when she had them, were simple. A full night's sleep, a walk in a park without the weight of a ticking clock, a single day where the gnawing anxiety in her stomach would cease. She lived a life she had not chosen, bound by a love that felt indistinguishable from a prison sentence. Her hands, capable of unknotting the deepest pains in strangers, were powerless to free herself. She stood at her window, watching the city breathe below, unaware that a force was about to enter her life that would offer an escape, but at a cost that might shatter her completely. The city awakened with a groan, a symphony of distant sirens and the rumble of the early morning train that vibrated through the thin floorboards of her apartment. For Ilara, dawn was not a promise but a summons. Her routine was a silent, unvarying ritual, a mechanical sequence designed to conserve every ounce of energy for the day ahead. The cold water on her face was a shock that momentarily cleared the fog of insufficient sleep. She dressed in the semi-darkness, her movements economical and precise, pulling on the simple, dark uniform that rendered her anonymous. There was no lingering over coffee, no quiet moment of contemplation. Her life was a clock that had been wound too tight, and every tick was a reminder of the responsibilities that awaited her, both at the opulent hotel and in the small, shadowed room down the hall. Her commute was a daily lesson in social geography, a journey across invisible but unassailable borders. The bus wheezed and shuddered through the gray, forgotten streets of her neighborhood, collecting the city's army of service workers, the tired, the overlooked, the essential. Ilara would press her forehead against the cool, grimy glass, watching as the landscape transformed. The graffitied brick and boarded-up storefronts gradually gave way to manicured parks, gleaming glass towers, and luxury boutiques. By the time she stepped off the bus near the hotel, she had crossed into another country, one where the air seemed cleaner. The people moved with an unhurried grace, and the weight of survival was a concept as foreign as a distant star. She was a trespasser here, granted temporary passage only to serve. The oppressive atmosphere of her home was not one of anger or conflict, but of a quiet, pervasive sorrow. Her mother, propped against a tower of pillows, communicated with her eyes, a flicker of gratitude, a shadow of pain, a deep, abiding guilt for the burden she had become. Ilara would sit on the edge of the bed, spoon-feeding her broth, her touch gentle, her voice a soft murmur of reassurance. But beneath the loving care was a current of resentment she would never dare acknowledge, a silent scream against the injustice of it all. This room was her anchor and her cage. The bond with her mother was forged of the purest love, yet it was also the very chain that kept her shackled to a life of relentless, sacrificial duty, preventing any hope of a future that was solely her own. The financial pressure was a physical presence in their small apartment, a third resident that was both silent and suffocating. A precarious stack of envelopes sat on the corner of the kitchen counter, a monument to their desperation. Each one, with its bold red lettering and threatening legal jargon, was a paper cut to her soul. She would handle them with a sense of dread, her stomach twisting into a familiar knot. Every hour she spent at the spa, every muscle she soothed, was translated into a number that felt pitifully small against the colossal, ever-growing sum they owed. The debt was a hungry beast, and she was feeding it pieces of her own life, her youth, her energy, her dreams, knowing with a chilling certainty that it would never be satiated. This relentless cycle of work and caregiving had carved a moat of isolation around her. The easy camaraderie of her colleagues at the spa was something she observed from a distance. Their casual invitations for after-work drinks or weekend outings were met with her polite, practiced refusals. "I have to get home," she would say, the simple phrase a full explanation of her circumscribed existence. She had no energy for friendships, no time for the shared intimacies that build connection. Her loneliness was a quiet, constant companion, a hollow space inside her that echoed with the life she wasn't living. She had forgotten how to be anything other than a caregiver and a worker, her own identity dissolving into the needs of others until she was nearly transparent. In the rare moments she interacted with extended family, usually a brief, strained phone call with a well-meaning but distant aunt, the expectations of a traditional life were laid bare. There were gentle proddings about her future, questions about whether she had met anyone special, suggestions that a good husband could ease her burdens. These comments, meant to be kind, felt like stones thrown at a fractured window. They highlighted a path she could not even see, let alone follow. The idea of marriage, of a shared life, was a fantasy from another world. How could she invite someone into this life of debt and sickness? How could she offer a heart that was already mortgaged to duty, a spirit so worn down it had no room left for hope? Her own bedroom was a reflection of this suspended existence. It was a space devoid of personality, more a monastic cell than a young woman's sanctuary. The walls were bare, the single bed neatly made with a faded quilt. There were no photographs, no treasured mementos, no clutter of a life being actively lived. Everything was functional, Spartan, and temporary, as if she were merely a guest in her own home, waiting for a life that had yet to begin. The room was a physical manifestation of her inner world, tidy on the surface, but empty of joy, color, or aspiration. It was a place to collapse from exhaustion, not a place to dream. It held the silence of her unspent youth and the echo of a future she was too afraid to imagine. Some nights, after her mother was settled, and the apartment fell into a deep silence broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator, Ilara would stand by her window. The city sprawled below her, a breathtaking tapestry of light and motion. It was a world of infinite possibilities, of laughter in bars, of couples walking hand in hand, of lives unfolding in 1,000 different ways. She watched it all with the detached longing of a ghost, gazing into the world of the living. A profound sense of being outside of it all would wash over her, a wave of such intense loneliness that it was hard to breathe. The glass felt like the barrier of an aquarium, and she was trapped inside, watching a vibrant world she could never join. This profound isolation had preserved her innocence, but it was a sterile, joyless preservation. Her virginity was not a treasure she was saving, but a room in her house that had never been opened. It was a testament to a life lived on the sidelines, a body that had only ever been a tool for labor and a vessel for worry. There had been no space for the thrilling, terrifying vulnerability of a first kiss, no opportunity for the clumsy exploration of desire. The very idea felt like a luxury, an indulgence she could not afford. It was another part of herself that had been sacrificed at the altar of necessity, a quiet, unmourned casualty of a life defined by the word no. And so, she existed, trapped in a delicate, unbearable equilibrium. She was held in place by the immense gravity of her love for her mother and the crushing pressure of their circumstances. Every day was a repeat of the last, a slow erosion of her spirit. She was a spring wound so tightly that she had forgotten what it felt like to be at rest. The feeling of being prepared for a life she did not want was no longer a fear. It was her reality. She was already living it. She was drowning slowly in plain sight, unaware that the man who would offer her a lifeline was the same one who might pull her into a deeper, more dangerous current than she could ever imagine. He arrived at the spa not like a guest seeking solace, but like a storm front gathering on the horizon, a shift in atmospheric pressure that the staff felt before they saw him. Julian Thorne. The name was whispered in the hushed corridors. A two-word summary of ruthless power and immense, untouchable wealth. He was a legend in the city's financial district, a man who didn't build empires but rather acquired their bones after the fall. His visits were infrequent, unannounced, and always disruptive to the spa's carefully curated tranquility. The managers would scurry, the most senior therapists would clear their schedules, and a palpable tension would settle over the gilded sanctuary. He was not a client to be pleased, but a force to be managed, a problem to be contained before it could fully manifest. His presence filled the reception area, absorbing the light and sound around him. He was tall, dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second, more formidable skin. There was nothing soft about him. His features were sharp, carved from unforgiving stone, and his eyes, a cold, piercing gray, swept over his surroundings with a look of bored appraisal, as if cataloging every weakness. He moved with an economy of motion that was both elegant and predatory, every gesture precise and controlled. He didn't speak to the receptionist. He simply stood before her, an imposing silhouette of impatience, and the entire staff understood it as a command. His silence was louder, and more demanding than any shout, a vacuum of emotion that pulled all the warmth from the air. That afternoon, fate, or perhaps just a chaotic schedule, intervened. The two senior therapists were already engaged in lengthy, high-paying treatments. The spa manager, flustered and visibly sweating, scanned the assignment sheet with panicked eyes. Her gaze landed on Ilara, who was quietly preparing her room for her next, far more ordinary client. With a deep, resigned breath, the manager approached her. The assignment was delivered in a low, urgent whisper. "Mr. Thorne, room 7. He requests deep tissue, focus on the neck and shoulders. No talking, under any circumstances." A knot of pure dread formed in Ilara's stomach. She had heard the stories of his cold dismissiveness, of therapists leaving his room with their confidence in tatters. She simply nodded, her own voice deserting her, and moved toward his designated suite. The treatment room was a haven of soft light, muted earth tones, and the gentle sound of a trickling water feature. It was Ilara's sanctuary, the one place in the world where her hands held all the power. But when she entered, she found him already there, standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the sprawling city below. He had changed into a spa robe, but it did little to soften his intimidating aura. He seemed to be claiming the view, owning the city from this high perch. He turned slowly as she closed the door behind her, his gray eyes locking onto hers. The air grew thick, charged with a silent, analytical energy. He was not seeing a therapist. He was seeing an instrument, and he was assessing its quality before allowing it to begin its work. Her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she prepared the oils, the scent of lavender and sandalwood usually a comfort, now feeling like a flimsy defense. She approached the table where he now lay, face down, and hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, with a quiet breath to steady herself, she placed her hands on his back. It was like touching marble. His muscles were coiled springs, a dense armor of tension so profound it felt less like stress and more like a permanent state of being. It was the back of a man who never rested, who was perpetually braced for an attack. As her fingers began to knead the rigid knots along his spine, she felt not just physical strain, but a deep, resonant loneliness, a coldness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. For Julian, the silence was the first relief. He was surrounded all day by noise, the clamor of the trading floor, the sycophantic chatter of his subordinates, the endless demands on his time and fortune. He had expected the usual inane questions, the forced pleasantries. But there was nothing. Only the sound of her breathing, steady and quiet, and the focused, intelligent pressure of her hands. Her touch was different. It wasn't just technically proficient. It was intuitive. It was as if her fingers could listen, finding the epicenters of his pain without him needing to guide her, working with a confidence that was completely at odds with the nervous young woman he had briefly seen when he first turned from the window. The anonymity of her silent work was a strange and unsettling comfort. As the hour progressed, something within him began to yield. It was an unfamiliar sensation, this slow, unwilling surrender of control. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, a sound of release so involuntary it startled him. Ilara felt the change instantly, the subtle loosening of the cables across his shoulders, the fractional decrease in the rigid set of his jaw, which she could feel through the muscles in his neck. She was not just easing his physical pain. She was touching the source of it, the tightly wound core of a man who had walled off his own humanity. It was an intimate act, far more so than any touch he had experienced in years, and it was happening in complete, unnerving silence. For her, it was a moment of profound connection. For him, it was a terrifying breach of his defenses. When the session concluded, she stepped back, her own body aching with the effort of breaking through his resistance. He rose from the table with a fluid grace that seemed restored, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, the cold mask firmly back in place, but his eyes were different. The boredom was gone, replaced by an intense, probing curiosity. He looked at her not as a service provider, but as a puzzle he needed to solve. He studied her face, her simple, unadorned uniform, the faint blush on her cheeks. He was dissecting her, trying to understand the source of the quiet power in her hands. He said nothing, but his gaze was a question, a challenge, and a silent acknowledgement that she had, in some small, infuriating way, gotten the better of him. At the front desk, as he signed the bill, his movements were once again sharp and decisive. But he paused, his pen hovering over the paper, and his gaze dropped to her shoes peeking out from beneath her uniform trousers. He saw the worn soles, the faint scuff marks that spoke of long walks to and from the bus stop. He saw the slight, exhausted tremor in her hand as she held out the receipt for him. In that single fleeting moment, his mind, always calculating, always assessing value and weakness, made a connection. He saw the stark contrast between the profound relief she could provide and the evident poverty of her own life. A cold, cynical idea began to form, a transaction that would test his deepest, most bitter beliefs about the world. After he was gone, a ghost of his expensive cologne lingering in the air, Elara leaned against the cool wall of her treatment room, her heart still beating a little too fast. The encounter had left her drained, but also strangely electrified. She had touched a man made of ice and had felt, for a moment, the fire of a furnace burning deep within him. It was a frightening and deeply compelling sensation. She had looked into the eyes of a predator and had seen not just power, but a vast and desolate emptiness. The memory of his analytical gaze, the way it seemed to strip her bare, stayed with her. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this would not be their last encounter. She had disturbed his peace, and he had irrevocably disturbed hers. His name on her schedule the following week was not a surprise, but a premonition fulfilled. It appeared without fanfare, a simple block of text. Julian Thorne, 90 minutes. Deep tissue. Requested. Vance. The last two words sent a tremor through her. The spa manager gave her a look that was a mixture of envy and warning, a silent acknowledgement that Elara had been singled out. The other therapists fell quiet as she passed, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves behind her. The spa, once her anonymous sanctuary, now felt like a stage, and a spotlight had just found her. She was no longer just a pair of healing hands. She was now inextricably linked to the hotel's most enigmatic and intimidating client, a connection she had neither sought nor understood, but which now defined her in the eyes of everyone around her. Walking into the treatment suite felt different this time, charged with the memory of their first encounter. The air seemed to hold a residual trace of his presence, a ghost of his expensive, sharp cologne lingering beneath the spa's calming scents of eucalyptus and cedar. She ran her hands over the fresh linens on the massage table, the simple act feeling fraught with a new significance. She was more aware of herself, of the soft sound of her rubber-soled shoes on the stone floor, of the nervous rhythm of her own breathing. Last time, she had been a professional performing a service. Now she felt like a woman walking into a room with a man whose profound tension she had held in her hands, whose deep, involuntary sigh of release she had felt resonate through her own body. He was already there, but not on the table. He was seated in the armchair in the corner, still in his dark, tailored trousers and a crisp, white shirt, his suit jacket draped over the back of the chair. He watched her as she moved about the room, preparing the oils, dimming the lights. His gaze was not passive. It was an active, analytical force, tracking her every small, efficient movement. He seemed to be deconstructing her, stripping away the professional uniform to see the mechanics beneath. The silence was heavier than before, not a peaceful void, but a space filled with his unspoken observation. He was no longer just a client seeking relief. He was a scientist observing a specimen, and she felt pinned under the microscope of his cold gray eyes. When he finally moved to the table and she laid her hands on his back, the connection was instant and electric. The landscape of his muscles was familiar territory, but her exploration of it was now tinged with a dangerous new awareness. There was an intimacy to the silence that felt less professional and more conspiratorial. Every knead of a knotted muscle, every long, soothing stroke along his spine, felt like a question she was asking without words. And the subtle yielding of his body beneath her touch felt like an answer. She could feel the tightly coiled energy within him, a lifetime of control and restraint, and her hands were a direct conduit to it. She was touching the very source of his power and his pain, a proximity that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Halfway through the session, he shattered the established protocol. His voice, low and rough, cut through the quiet hum of the air filter. "Why do you do this?" he asked, his head still resting in the face cradle. The question was abrupt, personal, and entirely out of bounds. It wasn't a query about her technique or her training. It was a question about her life, her choices. Ilara's hands froze for a fraction of a second over his shoulders. The boundary between them, so carefully maintained by silence and professionalism, had just been breached. He was demanding to see past the therapist, to know the woman, and the unexpected intrusion sent a jolt of panic and a strange, unwelcome thrill through her veins, leaving her completely unbalanced. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry, and tried to compose herself, her hands resuming their motion, though they now felt clumsy and uncertain. "It's what I'm good at," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, hoping the generic answer would suffice, that it would rebuild the wall he had just knocked down. But she knew it was a feeble defense. He said nothing more, but the silence that followed was altered. He had proven his point. With a single question, he could disrupt her composure, peel back a layer of her anonymity. He had reached past her hands and touched her, and in doing so had asserted a new kind of dominance in the room. He was no longer just a body to be worked on. He was a conscious, probing intelligence, and she was his new, fascinating puzzle. The appointments became a ritual, a fixed point in both their weeks. Tuesdays at 4, Fridays at 2, the spa staff stopped whispering and started watching her with a kind of fearful reverence. Julian Thorne's standing reservation was an unprecedented event. For Ilara, these sessions became the center around which her exhausting life revolved. They were islands of intense, charged silence in an ocean of worry and fatigue. She would anticipate them with a mixture of profound dread and a secret, shameful excitement. The brief 90 minutes she spent with him were the only moments when she felt truly seen, even if his gaze was cold and analytical. He was a dangerous gravitational force, and she felt herself being pulled into his orbit, losing her own steady trajectory. A strange and frightening desire began to bloom in the barren landscape of her heart. It was a fascination with the man himself, with the vast, desolate loneliness she felt beneath his armor. She found herself thinking about him at odd hours, while washing dishes, while waiting for the bus, while sitting by her mother's bedside. She wondered about the source of the immense pain coiled in his shoulders, about the life he lived in the penthouse suites and boardrooms that were as distant as the moon. This curiosity was terrifying because it was the first thing she had ever truly wanted for herself. It was a selfish, dangerous impulse that had no place in her life of duty and sacrifice, a seed of rebellion taking root in the carefully controlled soil of her existence. The pressure from the outside world, however, did not relent. It intensified, as if to punish her for this internal shift. A final eviction notice appeared, its stark red letters a scream of impending doom. Her mother developed a complication that required a new, prohibitively expensive medication, a monthly cost that was more than Ilara's entire salary. The walls were closing in, the air growing thinner. Each bill, each threatening letter, was a reminder of her powerlessness. This crushing reality made the silent, charged world of the treatment room with Julian feel like an even more potent escape. He was the embodiment of a power she desperately lacked, a force that could command the world to bend to his will, a world that was currently breaking her. Julian, in turn, was a man at war with his own fascination. He was a student of weakness, and he saw it in her. The deepening shadows under her eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor of exhaustion in her hands as she signed his receipt. Yet her touch grew more confident with each session, her quiet presence a balm to his frayed nerves. This contradiction infuriated him. How could someone so fragile possess such a potent, disarming strength? He told himself it was a simple curiosity, a problem to be solved, and then discarded. But he started to notice things beyond her fatigue, the determined set of her jaw, the deep well of sadness in her eyes that never quite disappeared, the quiet dignity in her worn-out uniform. One evening, leaving the hotel late after a board meeting, he saw her. She was standing at the bus stop across the wide, rain-slicked avenue, huddled under the flimsy shelter. The city lights glittered around her, but she seemed to be in her own small bubble of weary isolation. From the warm, leather-scented interior of his chauffeured sedan, he watched her. The image was a brutal diptych, his world of insulated, effortless power, and hers of cold, patient waiting. He saw her pull her thin cardigan tighter against the biting wind, and an unfamiliar, unwelcome emotion stirred in his chest. It was a sharp, uncomfortable pang that felt dangerously close to empathy, a feeling he had long ago excised from his emotional vocabulary. He was furious with himself. Why had he instructed his driver to pause? Why was he watching this girl as if she were some kind of tragic heroine? He was Julian Thorne. He did not indulge in sentiment. He dealt in assets, liabilities, and calculated risks. She was a service provider, an effective one, but nothing more. Yet, he couldn't shake the image of her small, solitary figure against the vast, indifferent city. He was a man who bought and sold companies based on their vulnerabilities, and he recognized hers with an expert's eye. Her desperation was a tangible thing, a commodity he could almost taste in the air, and his mind, by its very nature, began to calculate its value. The breaking point came during a Friday session. Ilara had been awake for nearly 48 hours, tending to a fever her mother had developed. Her movements were heavy, her focus blurred by a blinding exhaustion. As she worked on the complex muscles of his neck, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room tilted, the soft music fading to a distant hum. Her hand, resting on his shoulder, trembled violently, a small, uncontrollable earthquake. It was a complete betrayal by her own body, a public display of the fragility she worked so hard to conceal, a moment of utter and complete failure in front of the one person whose composure she could not afford to disturb. Before she could recover, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was not gentle, it was like steel, a manacle of strength that arrested her tremor instantly. He turned his head, his gray eyes, sharp and piercing, locking onto hers. The professional distance between them evaporated in that shocking, illicit touch. It was the first time they had made skin-to-skin contact outside the formal context of the massage. "You're exhausted," he stated, his voice a low, cold accusation. It wasn't a question or an expression of concern. It was a diagnosis of a weakness he had been observing for weeks, and his tone held a note of dark, unsettling satisfaction, as if he had finally proven a long-held theory. Shame, hot and absolute, flooded her cheeks. She pulled her wrist from his grasp as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. In that single moment, he had seen everything. The sleepless nights, the gnawing anxiety, the slow, grinding erosion of her strength. She felt utterly exposed, her private suffering laid bare and dissected by his cold, analytical gaze. The power dynamic, already skewed, had now irrevocably shattered. She was no longer the healer with the quiet power in her hands. She was a girl on the verge of collapse, and he was the man who had not only witnessed it but had, in a way, been waiting for it. The room felt small, suffocating, a cage she had willingly entered. For Julian, this was the final piece of data he required. Her physical collapse confirmed her desperation. Her fierce, humiliated pride in pulling away confirmed her spirit. The potent combination was irresistible to his cynical nature. He saw the path forward with chilling clarity. He could solve her problems, erase her debts, lift the crushing weight from her shoulders. He could do it with a flick of his pen. In return, he would take the one thing she had left that was pure and untouched, not for pleasure, but for proof. He would prove to himself that even this quiet dignity, this healing innocence, had its price. It was a perfect, cold, and logical transaction that would validate his entire worldview. He ended the session abruptly, rising from the table with a decisive grace that belied the tension of the last few moments. He dressed in silence, his movements precise and controlled. Ilara stood frozen by the wall, her captured wrist still tingling, her mind racing with fear and confusion. He did not leave immediately. He turned to face her, his expression a mask of unreadable intent. His gray eyes held hers, and the air crackled with a new, terrifying energy. "We need to talk," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Not here. I will send a car for you tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. It was not a request. It was a summons, a command that promised to change everything, plunging her into a dilemma that would tear her soul in two. The black sedan moved through the city's glittering veins like a phantom, silent and insulated from the world Ilara knew. When it glided to a stop before a tower of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the night sky, she felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she had been transported to another planet. The doorman, a figure of stoic professionalism, opened her door without a flicker of surprise, his gaze sliding right past her as if she were an invisible component of the building's machinery. The lobby was a cathedral of cold marble and echoing silence, and the private elevator ascended with a stomach-lurching smoothness that felt like a final, irreversible departure. With every floor she passed, she felt herself leaving behind not just the ground, but the very moral foundation upon which her small, difficult life had been built. The elevator doors opened directly into his penthouse, and he was there, waiting. He stood silhouetted against a wall of glass that framed the entire city, a breathtaking panorama of light and shadow that he seemed to possess. The space was not a home. It was a statement of power, vast, minimalist, and sterile, furnished with sharp angles and cold surfaces. He wore dark trousers and a simple gray cashmere sweater, an outfit that was somehow more intimidating than his business suits, because it suggested a private, unguarded self he was now allowing her to see. He said nothing as she stepped inside, simply watching her with those analytical gray eyes, and the silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket filled with the unspoken terms of their brutal, unnatural contract, a deal that felt profane in its simplicity. He gestured not to a comfortable sofa, but to a single glass of water sitting on a stark, black granite counter. The gesture was devoid of hospitality. It was a provision, a functional offering before the business at hand. Ilara's hands were clammy, her throat tight with a fear so primal it threatened to choke her. She could feel the weight of every choice that had led her to this moment. The eviction notice, the pharmacy bills, the memory of her mother's pained, feverish eyes. The urge to turn and flee, to run back to the safety of her cramped, familiar world, was a physical force, but the image of her mother's face, etched with worry and quiet suffering, was a stronger one. It was an anchor holding her in place, forcing her to see this horrifying act of transgression through to its conclusion. As he led her from the main living area toward a long, shadowed hallway, he must have seen it in her face, the raw, unfeigned terror that made her movements stiff and robotic. He had likely expected tears, or perhaps a hardened transactional resolve, but not this. Not the wide-eyed, frozen stillness of a small animal facing a predator. A vulnerability so absolute it was almost an accusation. He stopped, his hand hovering near the wall, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than cold calculation crossed his features. It was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, a crack in the polished marble of his composure. Her genuine fear was a variable he had not properly accounted for, a piece of data that did not fit his cynical equation of the world, and it momentarily threw his entire carefully constructed plan off its axis. The bedroom was as vast and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, dominated by a large, unadorned bed and another staggering view of the city lights. Ilara stood just inside the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile gesture of self-protection. He didn't approach her immediately. He remained near the door, creating a space between them that was filled with a tense, vibrating energy. "You don't have to pretend," he said, his voice a low, rough sound that seemed out of place in the pristine silence. The words were not meant to be kind, but they had an unintended effect. He was expecting a performance, a role she was meant to play in his bleak drama. But Ilara had no performance to give. She had only her authentic, paralyzing fear, and this was what she offered him now, a silent testament to the price of her sacrifice. He crossed the space between them slowly, his movements deliberate, as if approaching a wild, easily startled creature. He didn't reach for her body, but for her hand, the one he had seen tremble so often. He gently uncurled her fingers from their tight grip on her arm, his touch surprisingly warm against her cold skin. When he leaned in to kiss her, it was not the kiss of a conqueror, but of a man searching for something he had long since lost. It was hesitant, awkward, and deeply uncertain. For Ilara, who had never been kissed, the sensation was a shocking, overwhelming wave of warmth, and the faint, clean scent of his skin. In that single, clumsy point of contact, a terrifying and unfamiliar current of desire sparked to life, a small, flickering flame in the cold, dark room of her fear. The raw, unpracticed innocence of her response shattered something within him. He pulled back, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes wide with a confusion that bordered on pain. The cold mask of Julian Thorne, the vulture, dissolved, revealing the wounded man beneath. "She laughed at me," he whispered, the words torn from a place deep inside him, a confession he had never intended to make. The whole time. She took everything, and she was laughing. He wasn't speaking to Alara anymore, but to the ghost of his past, the betrayal that had frozen his heart and taught him to believe that everything, and everyone, had a price. He had brought Alara here to prove that cynical truth once more, but her genuine terror and unstudied tenderness had instead become a mirror, forcing him to look at the origins of his own brokenness. Faced with this sudden, shocking display of vulnerability, Alara's own fear receded, replaced by a wave of an emotion she understood far better: empathy. The healer's instinct, buried beneath her own despair, rose to the surface. She saw not the powerful millionaire who had sought to buy her, but a man drowning in a pain so old it had become a part of his very bones. Without thinking, she raised her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched his cheek. It was a simple, uncalculated gesture of comfort, the same way she would soothe her mother after a nightmare. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and in that moment she shared her own burden. Sometimes the weight, it's too much to carry alone. The chasm between them, of wealth, of power, of experience, vanished, leaving only two lonely souls in a dark room. The physical act that followed was no longer a transaction, it was a search for solace, a desperate and tender collision of two worlds. It was quiet and achingly slow, a discovery rather than a conquest. For Alara, it was a profound and painful awakening, a claiming of a body that had only ever been a vessel for work and worry. For Julian, it was a terrifying surrender, a letting go of the iron control that had been his only defense for years. There was no passion in the conventional sense, only a raw, desperate need to connect, to feel something real in a world that had become a sterile performance. It was an act of profound intimacy, born not of love or desire, but of a shared, unbearable loneliness, a quiet union of two deeply fractured people. Afterward they lay tangled in the fine linen sheets, not speaking, the silence between them no longer cold and transactional, but heavy with the weight of their unplanned confessions. The city lights outside the vast window seemed to hold their breath, silent witnesses to the night's irrevocable alchemy. The contract, with its cruel and simple terms, had been incinerated in the quiet fire of their shared vulnerability. He was no longer the cynical buyer, and she was no longer the desperate seller. They were something else entirely, something undefined and frightening. The money, the debt, the reasons she had come here, all of it felt distant and insignificant compared to the raw emotional landscape they had just navigated together. The night had changed everything, and as the first hint of dawn threatened to break the darkness, neither of them knew what the light would reveal. The first light of dawn was a cruel intruder, slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows and exposing the cold, sterile reality of the room. The fragile intimacy of the night dissolved like a dream upon waking, leaving behind a residue of shame and confusion. Alara watched as Julian moved, his body once again becoming a fortress of controlled, economical gestures. He pulled on his clothes with a practiced efficiency that seemed designed to erase the memory of their shared vulnerability. The silence between them was no longer a space of shared confession, but a chasm, wide and unbridgeable. Every object in the vast minimalist space, the cold glass, the sharp-edged furniture, seemed to accuse her, reflecting her own transgression back at her with a stark, unforgiving clarity. She felt like a ghost who had overstayed her welcome in a world she was never meant to inhabit. Before he left the room, he placed a single, crisp bank envelope on the nightstand. It landed with a soft, final thud that echoed louder than a gunshot in the silent room. He didn't look at her as he did it. The gesture was impersonal, clinical, a final closing of a ledger. It was the money, the promised fortune, the entire reason she was there. But seeing it now, a physical manifestation of their contract, felt like a branding. It was a cold, hard reminder that despite the raw, unplanned intimacy, despite his whispered confession and her genuine empathy, he had reverted to the original terms. He had reduced their shared, broken humanity back into a simple, sordid transaction. The envelope was not a gift of freedom, it was her price tag, a stark confirmation of his bleak and cynical worldview, which she had now irrevocably validated. The ride home in the silent, leather-scented sedan was a journey through a landscape of shame. The city, which had seemed so full of threatening life the night before, now looked gray and exhausted. Ilara stared out the tinted window, her own reflection a pale, ghostly image superimposed over the passing streets. She clutched the bank receipt, a simple slip of paper confirming the wire transfer, in her hand, its sharp edges digging into her palm. It felt both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly flimsy, a symbol of everything she had gained and everything she had lost. When the car pulled away from her curb, leaving her standing on the familiar, cracked pavement, the contrast was a physical blow. She had just left a king's palace and returned to her hovel, carrying the king's gold, and the sole deep stain of how she had earned it. She entered her mother's room as quietly as a thief. The familiar scent of antiseptic and clean linens filled her lungs, a scent that had once meant duty and love, but now smelled of her own deceit. Her mother was sleeping, her face relaxed and free from the lines of pain, and a wave of love so fierce it was agonizing washed over Ilara. This was why she had done it. For this peaceful face, for this fragile life. She had secured her mother's future, but in doing so had poisoned the very foundation of their bond. The money was a monstrous secret that now lived between them, a silent, unacknowledged wall. She smoothed the blanket over her mother's frail form. Her hands, the same hands that had touched Julian Thorne with an unplanned tenderness, now trembling with the unbearable weight of her silent, solitary sacrifice. In his glass tower overlooking the city, Julian stood under the punishing spray of a scalding hot shower, trying to wash the scent of her from his skin. It was a futile effort. Her presence lingered in his pristine apartment like a stubborn ghost. The memory of her fearful eyes, the unpracticed warmth of her kiss, the quiet dignity of her surrender. He had set out to prove a simple, ugly truth about the world, and in a way he had succeeded. He had bought her. But the victory felt like a profound defeat. Her genuine, unfeigned vulnerability had bypassed all his defenses and touched the core of his old, festering wound. He had expected to feel vindicated, powerful, in control. Instead, he felt hollowed out, haunted by a connection he had never wanted and had immediately sought to destroy. The days that followed were a blur of mechanical actions for Ilara. She went online, her fingers moving stiffly over the keyboard, and paid every outstanding bill. The eviction notice was nullified. The pharmacy confirmed a year's supply of the new, life-saving medication. The mountain of debt that had shadowed her entire adult life vanished with a series of quiet clicks. There was no joy in it, no triumphant sense of relief. Each payment was a small, agonizing act of confession to herself. This is what it cost. This is the price. The numbers in her bank account dwindled, replaced by receipts and confirmations of payment. She had bought her mother's safety and her own freedom from worry, but she felt more trapped than ever, a prisoner in a life that was now funded by the single greatest shame she had ever known. A week later, the final blow came, delivered with the same impersonal efficiency as the money. A call from the spa manager, her voice a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Mr. Thorne's office called," she said. "He's canceling all his future appointments. Indefinitely." The words were a clean, surgical cut. He was severing the only thread that still connected them, erasing her from his life as easily as deleting a calendar entry. The silent, charged sanctuary of the treatment room, the only place where she had felt a flicker of power and a strange, dangerous connection, was now just another room. The separation was complete. He had taken what he wanted, paid his due, and vanished, confirming in the cruelest way possible that for him, she had been nothing more than a temporary, albeit effective, remedy for a problem. In the suffocating silence of her new reality, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to take root. The constant, gnawing anxiety about money, the fear that had been her companion for years, was gone. In its absence was a vast, empty space. At first, this space was filled with guilt and shame. But slowly, something else began to grow there. A hard, resilient kernel of strength. She had walked into the lion's den, faced an impossible choice, and had not only survived but had seen the wounded creature beneath the predator's skin. She had made a devastating choice, but it had been her choice. The powerlessness that had defined her existence was gone, replaced by the terrifying and liberating knowledge that she was capable of making choices that could shatter worlds, including her own. Her mother's health began to improve almost immediately with a new medication. A faint touch of color returned to her cheeks, and the light in her eyes grew stronger. It was the miracle Ilara had prayed for, the very outcome she had sold herself to achieve. Yet, this tangible proof of her success only deepened her isolation. She couldn't share the source of this miracle. She had to smile and accept her mother's tearful gratitude, the love in her eyes feeling like a judgment. She felt like a fraud in her own home, the architect of a salvation built on a foundation of lies. The love that had driven her to this act was now the source of her deepest pain, separating her from the one person she had sought to protect. They existed now in their separate self-imposed prisons. Julian, in his penthouse, was surrounded by the immense wealth that had failed to protect him from the memory of her touch, his cynicism now a cold and lonely comfort. He had won his bet with the world, but lost a part of himself he didn't know he had left. And Ilara, in her small, quiet apartment, was finally free from the burdens that had defined her, only to be shackled by the nature of her liberation. She would stand by the window, looking out at the same city lights, no longer a ghost dreaming of a life she couldn't have, but a survivor grappling with the unbearable cost of the life she had bought. The chasm between them was absolute, yet they were bound forever by the shared memory of a single, soul-altering night. Months bled into a season, and the sharp edges of Ilara's shame began to soften, worn down by the quiet, steady rhythm of a life no longer governed by terror. Her mother's laughter, a sound she hadn't heard in years, now occasionally filled the small apartment, a fragile but beautiful melody of recovery. The absence of financial dread left a vast, quiet space in Ilara's soul, a silence she was slowly learning to fill not with guilt, but with the tentative whispers of her own desires. She left the opulent prison of the hotel spa, finding work at a small community wellness center where her hands were a gift, not a commodity. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, sorting through the mail, that she saw it. A thick, cream-colored envelope with no return address, her name written across the front in a sharp, decisive, and achingly familiar script. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her first instinct was to tear it up, to throw it away and pretend it had never arrived, but her hands, those traitorous conduits of connection, refused to obey. Inside there was no money, only a single sheet of heavy paper. The letter was not an apology, for he was not a man who apologized. It was a confession. He wrote of a world built on transactions, a fortress of cynicism he had constructed to protect a hollow core. "You were meant to be the final brick in that wall," he wrote, "proof that everything has a price. Instead, you were a mirror." He told her he had established a foundation, a quiet, unpublicized fund to absorb the medical debts of families on the verge of collapse. It was named the Vance Trust. "Not for you," the letter concluded, "for me, to learn a different kind of accounting." Ilara read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through a film of tears she hadn't realized she was crying. The weight of her sacrifice, a burden she had carried in solitary silence, shifted. It was no longer a story of shame, but one of unforeseen consequence. Her act of desperation had not validated his bleak worldview. It had shattered it. She had walked into his cold, sterile world with her genuine fear and unplanned empathy, and in doing so had forced him to confront the ghost in his own machine. She was not a victim in his story. She was the catalyst that had forced a profound and seismic change. The knowledge was not a triumphant vindication, but a quiet, solemn release, a reframing of her past that allowed her, for the first time, to finally breathe. A week later, driven by a need for tangible proof, she found the address listed on the Foundation's modest website. It wasn't a gleaming tower, but a simple storefront office on a tree-lined street, a world away from his financial empire. She stood across the road, a ghost in the afternoon sun, and watched through the large plate glass window. And then she saw him. He wasn't flanked by assistants or lawyers. He was sitting at a simple table, across from a young couple who clutched a sheaf of papers, their faces etched with a familiar, weary anxiety. Julian was leaning forward, listening. There was no cold appraisal in his eyes, no predatory stillness. He was simply present, his focus absolute, his powerful hands resting quietly on the table. He was a man engaged not in a takeover, but in an act of quiet, unadorned grace. A profound peace settled over Ilara, a sense of closure so complete it felt like a physical loosening in her chest. She did not need to speak to him, did not need him to see her. This was enough. Witnessing this quiet act of redemption was the only absolution she would ever require. The brutal contract between them had been fulfilled that night, but a new, unspoken one had been written in its place, one of mutual, unintentional healing. He was using his immense power to mend the kind of brokenness that had driven her to his door, and in doing so, he was mending himself. She finally understood that the most valuable thing she had given him that night was not her innocence, but a glimpse of a humanity he had forgotten he possessed. He had paid her debt, and now he was paying his own. She turned from the window and walked away, not looking back. The late afternoon sun warmed her face, and for the first time, she felt its heat not as a fleeting sensation but as a promise. The city no longer felt like a taunting, glittering party to which she wasn't invited. It felt like home, a place of infinite possibility. Her future was no longer an empty space defined by the absence of pain, but a blank canvas awaiting her touch. She didn't know where she was going, but she walked with a lightness in her step, a woman who had journeyed through the darkest of nights and had emerged into the dawn, scarred but whole, and finally, irrevocably free. If this story of sacrifice and redemption touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe, like, share, and comment on what you believe true freedom really means.